Tonight, President Trump takes aim at the Department of Education, sparking a nationwide debate over who should control America's classrooms.
Plus, a new wave of rockets from Gaza and Yemen. Israel under siege as the war with Hamas gets bloodier by the day.
And the battle over transgender medicine heats up. Hospitals put on notice as gender surgeries for children come under fire.
Their institution is going to risk losing federal funds if they choose to continue with these procedures.
Plus, bombs, terror, and cartel chaos inside Colombia's brutal drug war and how it's spilling into America's streets. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation.
A power struggle over America's classrooms. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
And good evening in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. The status quo in education is failing America's children. That's the White House message. And what it says is driving the motivation behind President Trump's latest action to reshape the federal government.
President Trump's bold plan taking shape in the form of another executive action aiming to return educational direction back to the states. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Michelle London joins us now. Michelle, can you give us an idea of what this could mean for students?
Good evening, John. While much of public school funding is already at the state and local level, the Education Department helps low-income students and those with disabilities. It also enforces civil rights laws to prevent discrimination and handles the process for students applying for college financial aid. The administration promises no impact on those programs. It's exploring how to move some key programs to other agencies. Trump has already cut the Education Department's workforce in half, affecting the agency's Office for Civil Rights and Institute for Education Sciences, which gathers data on the nation's academic progress. Critics are sounding the alarm, worried students will pay the ultimate price and fall even further behind. Sherry Few, president of a grassroots education advocacy organization, says since the department's inception back in 1979, learning scores remain on the decline.
Children on average across the country are only 30% proficient in math and reading. And I think one of the fact sheets with the White House as they're approaching this executive order shows that there's a state where there were 13 high schools where 0 children were proficient in math. So obviously what we're doing now is not working.
Few's organization recently mailed its proposed blueprint to Department Secretary Linda McMahon. It includes 5 steps to help students get on a better track to success. One involves privatizing student loans.
We're going to make students more savvy about borrowing money. We won't be lending money to students that can't prove that they have the ability to pay it back, or will have the ability once their college degree is completed.
Now, this executive order does give the president power to significantly diminish the department, but not end it. Congressional approval is needed to abolish the agency since it passed the law establishing the department. Few does plan to work with Congress to ensure this executive order is carried through.
All right, Michelle London, thank you very much. And here now for more, Mark Caleb Smith, director of the Center for Political Studies at Cedarville University. Mark, welcome. So your thoughts on this executive order setting in motion the dismantling of the Education Department?
Yeah, the Department of Education has long been a target for conservatives ever since its inception in 1979. And so in that sense, it's not really a big surprise that you would see Republicans kind of come against it at this level. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is this is an executive order. And as your story just said, this would take congressional action for it to truly wind down the Department of Education. I think it's also still up in the air whether the president has the power to unilaterally fire up to half of the Department of Education. And then what happens with those additional funds, of course, would remain to be seen as well. And so it's an executive order. It's a significant thing in and of itself. But the long-term consequences, I think, are still a good way off.
You just mentioned that it would take an act of Congress to dismantle the Department of Education. I want to ask you, though, from a standardization standpoint, the current iteration of the Department of Education came as a result, as I understand, of trying to train kids to do better in science and math to compete against Russia in the space race. How do you think states will fare without the role of the department playing this kind of center role of gathering information on teaching methods and student performance?
Yeah, I think that if they dismantle the department and we lose that kind of centralized ability to collect data and then to hold ourselves accountable to that data, that could be a pretty significant loss. At the same time, as I'm sure a lot of your viewers know, states have their own significant departments of education as well. There are still state standards in place, lots of collection of data taking place at the state level. And so it isn't as if those things would just quit happening. It's just they may happen at a lower level down the educational process. Your question about nationalized standards, I think, is a good question. And you can understand maybe how there would be some strengths to having sort of one approach that we take to math or to science. But I think anyone who's been in the classroom a long time will tell you these kind of approaches really just don't work well in terms of one size fits all. Giving, I think, more state and local variety would probably be better in the long run. But how this is going to work in terms of policy, we'd still have to kind of figure that out, I would think.
Yeah. So the administration of, as we're talking about, wants to move this really to the states.
Yeah.
States oversee education.
Right.
And Mark, how do you think the Founding Fathers would see this issue? Do you think they would approve or disapprove of moving education back to the states?
Well, I mean, when they were writing the Constitution, public education was very much a sliver of anything like what we would see today. There was education available, but it was a much more limited basis. Many children would have very little education at that point. And so it's a disconnected context to some degree compared to where we find ourselves. But I think on the whole, they would view education primarily as something you would do at the local level, at the family level, as opposed to something you'd want to be taken care of in a faraway place like Washington, D.C. And so I think in that sense, this would be faithful to the founders' vision. But, education today looks radically different than anything they would have imagined.
Yeah. All right, Mark Caleb-Smith with Cedarville University. Always good to see you. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Turning overseas, Israel is stepping up its ground offensive in Gaza, pushing deeper into the Strip just days after their negotiated ceasefire collapsed.
Israel says its forces are targeting Hamas infrastructure, hitting tunnels, weapon sites, and command centers. Airstrikes have killed hundreds, including women and children. That's according to Gaza's health ministry, which is under Hamas. At one family home flattened by a strike, rescue crews found a month-old baby girl alive beneath the rubble. In Israel, concerns are growing for the remaining 59 hostages held by Hamas. And at the United Nations, powerful testimony from Eli Sharabi, freed just 6 weeks ago, and whose family was killed by Hamas while he was in captivity.
For 491 days, I was kept mostly underground in Hamas terror tunnels, chained, starved, beaten, and humiliated. I was held captive in the darkness, isolated from the world. I know that you discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often. But let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. I saw Hamas terrorists carrying boxes with the UN and UNRWA emblems on them into the tunnel. Dozens and dozens of boxes, paid by your government, feeding terrorists who tortured me.
In a new escalation, Israeli cities from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv are under attack. Hamas launched a rocket barrage at Tel Aviv, the first in months. Meanwhile, Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen fired several ballistic missiles at Israel. Fortunately, no casualties reported in either incident.
Joe Trusman joins us now. He is a senior research analyst and editor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Long War Journal. Joe, great to have you with us this evening. So we're now seeing attacks from Hamas and the Houthi rebels in Yemen. What do these attacks tell you about the broader threat Israel is facing right now? And are we looking at a coordinated multi-front escalation?
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. Yes, what we're witnessing right now is a multi-front coordinated effort, similar to what we observed at the beginning of the war for almost, from actually a little more than a year. But now these areas, these fronts, are a little weaker, which is good news, specifically Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iraq, and other areas. But at least with the Houthis in Yemen, they have stayed, they've kept the same strategy essentially. So what they're doing now and what we're observing, of course, is these ballistic missiles being fired. There's a lot to comprehend here, but I think the strategy, I think that the Houthis are doing right now, that what they're employing is the same that they've done before. But the concern here is how far are they going to go? Are they going to launch more ballistic missiles, more drones? And now we have the U.S. involved as well, so that's another factor at play.
Joe, you just mentioned other neighbors in the region like Iraq and Lebanon. What role is Iran playing behind the scenes? What does that mean for regional stability?
Right. So, yeah, if you look at each arena, right, whether it's Gaza, whether it's Lebanon, uh, even some parts of Syria, Yemen, for example, or Iraq, all these fronts have been involved with Israel. And what is the main actor behind all with that's involved with all these countries and all these arenas? It's Iran. And why is that? Because Iran has proxies in each of these regions, all right? And I didn't even mention the West Bank as well. So, nevertheless, Iran is using its proxies essentially to put pressure on the Israelis. What Iran wants right now, more than anything, is to save Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Not only Hamas, there's other Palestinian terrorist groups in the Gaza Strip as well, but its chief concern is Hamas. So how does it do that? How does it save Hamas? It employs its proxies to essentially, again, put pressure on Israel. And we're seeing it right now with the Houthis in Yemen.
So Israel, you know, it's always said that its goal is to destroy Hamas and free the hostages. But Joe, is there anything different this time around in this strategy, in this round of fighting, compared to previous operations?
I don't think the picture has changed that much, or the strategy. You could say tactics have changed, all right, military tactics. But I think the goal remains the same, getting those 59 remaining hostages out of the Gaza Strip. Also, I think the main problem here between Israel and Hamas is that mediators have not been able to overcome this obstacle that Hamas wants to stay in Gaza, wants to rule Gaza, but on the other hand, Israel does not want that. So this is a problem, and I think this is what's led to this military confrontation that we're seeing now.
All right, Joe Trusman with Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. Coming up, the battle over gender surgeries for kids. How the president's executive order could change the future of transgender medicine.
Welcome back. The Trump administration is turning up the heat on transgender policies. This week announcing a pause on $175 million in federal funding to the University of Pennsylvania for allowing a transgender athlete to compete on the women's swimming team.
Meanwhile, a federal judge has blocked the president's ban on transgender military service, but another fight is taking shape over children and gender surgeries. CBN's Heather Sells explains what's at stake.
Just days after the president issued his executive order, trans activists hit the streets of New York in a panic. Analyst Mary Rice Hassan says that's because the Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation order comes with powerful strings attached.
Principally, it's the power of federal funding, saying that organizations, whether it's a hospital, a medical practice, anyone who is taking federal funds, they are now going to feel the squeeze because their institution is going to risk losing federal funds if they choose to continue with these procedures.
It comes down to Trump versus a highly profitable industry. Attorney Sarah Parshall-Perry at the Heritage Foundation estimates doctors typically pocket $8,000 for each pediatric gender surgery.
There are 1,100 clinics and hospitals coast to coast that perform these procedures, and now they're going to have to think long and hard to see whether or not this will be continuously profitable for them to do so.
I was given puberty blockers and testosterone at 13 and had a double mastectomy at 15 years old.
Chloe Cole is one of the most outspoken detransitioners. Now at age 20, she believes Trump's actions mark the beginning of the end for the country's transgender movement. She's also warning, along with other advocates, of the fight before them.
We need to remember also that the left has spent decades building and establishing the current ideology. They're not going to vanish overnight.
Some hospitals have paused these procedures as multiple legal challenges are underway, including one by 18 state attorneys general. It argues that the federal order conflicts with state laws that guarantee access to these treatments.
Perry maintains that the order falls within the scope of the president's authority, though she admits that taking down the industry will involve more than just cutting federal money.
I do think it's going to take medical malpractice on a grand scale.
Lawsuits like the one Cole has filed against healthcare giant Kaiser Permanente.
Those of us who have detransitioned need to continue to file lawsuits to hold our doctors accountable.
Hassan says what could help those lawsuits is a federal law expanding the statute of limitations so that young adults can have time to process their trauma and come forward. The medical advocacy group Do No Harm notes one prominent group, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons, has expressed doubts about the effectiveness of trans surgeries for kids. Still, Do No Harm says the public should not ignore the pain that gender confusion can cause.
We understand that these children are really suffering, whether that be with anxiety, depression, autism. These children need care. They need compassionate care from mental health professionals that are free to work in a reality basis.
Heather Sells, CBN News.
They're up next, cartels, cocaine, and chaos. How a deadly drug war in Colombia is fueling America's crisis. When Faith Nation returns.
Welcome back. The Pentagon is considering a new plan to boost border security, giving more control along the southern border to the U.S. military.
ABC News reports it could include a buffer zone and temporary holding areas for migrants. Meanwhile, a crisis is growing beyond the border in Colombia, where cartels and guerrilla groups are turning communities into war zones. CBN's Chuck Holton has more.
It's a conflict most Americans know nothing about. Bombings, shootings, and clashes between guerrilla groups have turned Colombia into a battleground. The violence has left thousands homeless. Juan Galan's father was assassinated while running for office in the 1980s. Now he's entered politics, calling for a tougher stance on the cartels.
The current president, Gustavo Petro, set up a policy which is called Total Peace. And it's trying to build peace accords with every criminal organization in Colombia that mainly are supported by narcotraffic, the cocaine traffic. Also with the armed forces having debilitated their capacities.
These guerrilla groups control Colombia's cocaine trade, which supplies the U.S. drug market. Now that the Trump administration has cut off aid, Colombia's government is struggling to stop them. For years, the U.S. provided Black Hawk helicopters to help combat drug trafficking. And today, most sit idle. The freeze on U.S. aid has left the country's security forces without air support to fight these groups.
So a major war has erupted, leading to 26,000 people being displaced to our city. The fighting is still ongoing, and the National Army is trying to regain control of the area, but so far, without success.
About a third of all of the overdose deaths in the United States come from cocaine, not fentanyl. And the vast majority of the cocaine comes from here in Colombia. Now, that's controlled by one of two organizations, the FARC or the ELN. And those two organizations are being facilitated by the Venezuelan government right across the border here from me here in Cúcuta. The Trump administration has designated 8 cartels across Latin America as foreign terrorist organizations. But what the people here who are being pushed out of their homes are saying is that the Trump administration needs to focus more on the government of Nicolas Maduro.
There were bombs, gunfire, destruction everywhere. We had to leave because of the fighting between the FARC and ELN. The people with guns control everything, and we who work the land have to flee to survive.
This pile of rubble behind me is all that's left of a police station, if you can believe that. Just a couple nights ago, a car bomb went off right where I'm standing and leveled the entire building. Fortunately, it was late at night and nobody was inside, but this is the kind of violence we're seeing in this area, and this is the reason why people are fleeing their homes. Despite the Trump administration's cartel crackdown, many in Colombia question why the Biden administration removed the FARC from the terror list in 2021, especially as it continues to dominate the drug trade.
We need helicopters, and we need the cooperation and intelligence also, which is crucial. And now that President Trump has declared terrorists the narco-traffickers, total peace policy is going to fail. But with this decision of Trump, it has already an additional blow.
I think the most important thing is to have God's guidance in all of this. Every morning, we put our work in God's hands, and I believe that's why things have gone well so far.
While Colombia faces its worst security crisis in years, the U.S. terror designation of drug cartels may be just the first step. Until these groups are fully crushed, the crisis and the drugs will continue to spread. From Cúcuta, Colombia, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Chuck, coming up, a sign of spring in the nation's capital. Next on Faith Nation.
Finally tonight, a cherished tradition kicks off in the nation's capital.
That's right. The National Cherry Blossom Festival begins today in Washington, D.C., bringing people from across the country and around the world to the city. Over 1 million visitors are expected to see the pink blossoms this year. Trees were originally gifted from Japan to the United States over a century ago as a symbol of friendship. This year, over 3,000 trees are blooming around the tidal basin where the annual Cherry Blossom Festival paddle boat race takes place. Jenna, we were just talking. Any plans to go down and visit?
Probably not. Yeah, it's so busy down there if you live here. If you've been, a few times, you might not have to go again.
Yeah, I'll just watch the pictures.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for watching.
Thanks for joining us. Take care.